What's going on, YouTube? My name is Batman, and I apologize for my absence of late. I recently went through a breakup, and its aftermath has preoccupied my mind wholly, leaving room for little else as I've couch-surfed the Golden State. As you always do after this sort of thing, you think about what went wrong, what ought to have been done differently. When things ended, she said, "This is about growth. We're not growing together anymore." I thought, what's the point of growth? You grow and you grow and you grow, and then guess what? You fucking die, and all your growth was for nothing. So why not just cling to what you love and milk it for every last drop while you still can? You see, my life was pretty good at 18. I was living every 8th grader's fantasy. I'd gotten into this program that let me go to the local community college for my senior year. The only reason I did it was the scheduling freedom it brought me. I only had to take 4 classes and arrange them so that 3 days out of the school week I could just stay home. I lived in the garage at my grandma's summer home, unsupervised most of the time, free to get high, eat junk food, and play Black Ops all fucking day. My girlfriend had double D's and a 00 waist. She belonged in a hentai porno. And she'd hang out all day too. We'd watch Desperate Housewives, The Office, Colbert Report, play Reach together, pig out on Chipotle, and fuck. As often as I could coax her into it, which was like 3 times a day on those days I had her all to myself. Things were good. I was happy. And as high school graduation and the transition to adulthood approached, my singular thought was, how do I preserve this life I've stumbled on? Money. But it was a catch-22. If you have to do college and a 9-to-5 to get the money, then you've abandoned the lifestyle the money was supposed to preserve. How do you break the Gordian knot, thread the needle? I had to somehow get rich without leaving my room. For some creative inspiration, I downed a 5-shot espresso and ate a pop brownie alone in the garage one day. My mind raced with a billion ideas. Dealing drugs, selling blood and semen, somehow playing a stock market I knew nothing about, and then I threw it all up, suffered some paranoid delusions, and passed out because the combo was more than I could handle. But when I woke up, I knew what I had to do. YouTube. The YouTube gaming community was just blowing up back then. Everybody and their dog getting in on it. You could make money just staying home and playing video games all day? I was fucking in. Back then I followed guys like Wings of Redemption, X-Jaws, and T-Martin. They made the shit look easy. Fast forward to today, X-Jaws lost his mind, Wings is clearly suffering from chronic depression, and T-Martin only seems able to survive because he is a complete psychopath who gets off on flexing for 10-year-olds. I recently read an article that concluded most successful YouTubers are burnt out, lonely, and depressed. I guess it always did seem too good to be true. But for a while, everything was going great. Wasn't making a lot of money, but enough. We did trips to the beach, camping, and after Destiny 1 dropped and I made like 10 grand in 2 months shitting on it, we did bigger trips. LA, fucking Disneyland twice, Coachella. I can't tell you how big my heart-on was for myself. In the meantime, I gave her all the money to handle. I didn't want to do shit. Bills, cooking, cleaning, grocery shopping, hotel reservations, passport applications, rent payments. I fucked with none of it. And at 23, I hadn't grown a day since 18. My strategy had worked, God help me. I had arranged it perfectly. My job, my girlfriend, my whole life built around a single organizing principle. Don't fucking grow up. Not considering it might one day wear her down. I was Peter Pan, it was codenamed Kids Next Door. My idea of a happy life was one where I had zero responsibility, got to do whatever I wanted and never had to do anything I didn't want to do. And I thought I was terribly clever because everything went according to plan and I only found out too late I was walking into a fucking buzzsaw. I'm not the only one to make this kind of mistake. Far from it. Turns out my entire generation is notorious for it. In books, television monologues, and op-eds, the commentariat has concluded kids these days aren't growing up. We're not buying cars or houses. A quarter of us still live with our parents. We're not getting married, having kids, or even having sex. We're opting out of the workforce at higher rates. When we do work, our managers say we have poor time management, worse social skills, and are frustrated that when we change jobs, we ghost our former employer like a bad date. We are stuck, as they say, in permanent adolescence. It's one of those rare issues that has found bipartisan consensus. From liberal provocateur Bill Maher's snarky blogs to Republican senator who wanted to be president since he was 13, Ben Sasse, who wrote an entire book on the subject. Millennials themselves have tacitly acknowledged it as well. The term adulting has gone viral on Twitter, an ironic and self-deprecating bit of slang that's used to describe as significant accomplishments things that used to be mundane chores like doing rent or paying the laundry. Adulting, or lack thereof, has reached pandemic levels, and now adulting classes have cropped up across the country, teaching legal adults how to cook onions, do taxes and shit. So you see, I'm not responsible for any of my own problems, okay? As always, I'm actually the victim of sociological circumstances beyond my control. I get to blame my parents and society for this, okay? And society includes all of you people, so thanks a lot, dicks. In reality, the causes are as varied as they are complex. Economists argue our problems are due to our coming of age during the Great Recession, and that the rising income inequality, stagnant wages, and widespread unemployment that defined the last decade made it extremely difficult for our generation to afford college, housing, and children, especially considering they are much more expensive in real dollar value today than for previous generations. Unable to acquire these things, we never had to adapt to the responsibility that accompanies them. Meanwhile, social scientists are convinced the root of the problem is that our brains haven't developed properly due to a combination of overprotective parents, participation trophy culture, and a lack of free play as children. They argue that our parents, likely suffering from severe anxiety in their own right thanks to the prevalence of disaster and tragedy porn during the rise of cable television throughout their generation, were too overprotective and shielded us from any negative stimuli. And now as adults we suffer from crippling anxiety because our brains never learned how to process fear, conflict, or setbacks. Schools and sports teams made sure that every kid, no matter how stupid, lazy, or irresponsible they were, got a trophy. So we do not understand failure or defeat and are convinced that we are good at everything, always ready to cast blame elsewhere when we do come up short somehow. Our time spent outdoors has plummeted to half of that of our parents, and we don't spend nearly as much time engaged in free play. That is, play with other children, unsupervised, with no rules, an activity that researchers have concluded is imperative to our emotional and neurological development, teaching us key social skills like how to interact with others fairly and how to regulate our emotions and impulses without the aid of a teacher or parent to comfort or instruct us. Thus we are oppressed, psychologically and economically. We are like a pathetic dandelion struggling to grow between the cracks on a sidewalk. The research mentions kids in these strictly controlled environments are much more likely to act out when finally on their own, and I can't help but remember that our generation also has a notorious binge drinking problem. Reading all this about our generation, I noticed a fascinating and eerie similarity to an article I read about Call of Duty. PC Gamer's interview with Red Orchestra 2 developer John Gibson, titled Call of Duty has ruined a generation of gamers. I've discussed this article at length before. Indeed, it may perhaps be the most important piece written on gaming in the last decade, and coming back to it now, I see it in a completely different light. It's striking to me how clearly Gibson's dismay with COD players mirrored the real world's frustration with millennials generally. He discussed how, while playtesting Red Orchestra, the participants, growing frustrated when they did poorly, would essentially respond, as Gibson summarizes, and I quote, "This game's just too hardcore. I'm awesome at Call of Duty, so there's something wrong with your game. I'm not the problem." He goes on to praise Call of Duty for doing what he calls smart business by compressing the skill gap with, and I quote, "a whole bunch of randomness, a whole bunch of weaponry that doesn't require any skill to get kills. Random spawns, massive cone fire on your weapons, lots of devices that can get kills with zero skills at all." And that watching them play, he feels they're poor FPS players, saying, and I quote, "It's not that they're incapable of getting good, it's that they've never had to. They get enough kills in Call of Duty to feel like they're awesome, but they never really had to develop their FPS skills beyond that." These complaints were echoed by other shooter developers who openly mocked COD for its simplicity and hand-holding in promos that went viral online. What is Gibson describing here if not a game that hands out participation trophy kills? A game that has hindered players' growth by shielding them from adversity. We know that a little over half of all gamers fall in the millennial age range, and that percentage rises dramatically if you don't count mobile gaming, suggesting significant overlap between millennials and COD's fanbase. And obviously Gibson, a Gen Xer, isn't referring to his own generation as being ruined. And so, without meaning to, and years before other researchers had discovered the trend, did a fucking game developer basically synthesize the chief sociological issues afflicting millennials that economists, social scientists, and US senators are only just freaking out about today? But what if he had it backwards? What if Call of Duty didn't ruin a generation of gamers, but simply catered to and profited off of a malfunction that was already there? It's not that crazy when you think about it, that our in-game behavior may be reflective of our real-life attitudes. What if COD's success and this phenomenon Gibson has observed are only symptomatic of the much larger endemic problem among today's youth? Indeed, instead of ruining, what if Call of Duty, in its ham-fisted pandering, has imported the maturity crisis to the gaming industry? And worst of all, what if in churning out these kinds of products to hundreds of millions of youth over the last 15 years, Call of Duty has in fact exacerbated the ongoing real-world maturity crisis, in the same way McDonald's exacerbates the obesity epidemic? Do you see what I'm getting at here? What if Call of Duty is to blame for my breakup? Unlike other artistic mediums, we know that games have a significant and measurable effect on our neurology, and researchers have found starkly different changes to the brain depending on what kind of game was being played. Often these changes are very positive, and in fact COD has been observed to help boost memory, creativity, and problem solving. But there are negative effects as well, as I've discussed at length in previous videos. Dopamine feedback loops, dampen amygdala activity affecting our emotional regulation, and atrophy of the hippocampus hampering our spatial navigation, all three of which are associated with COD as well. People often get bogged down in an argument about whether gaming is good or bad for you, but it's a silly discussion. It's like asking if food is good or bad for you. The reality is there's healthy food and junk food, and a spectrum in between. Some foods are debatable. Is fat good or bad? Protein builds muscles, but it's also bad for your heart. And often, foods that are good for some would be bad for others. The NFL player needs a very different kind of diet than his grandma does. Even among professional physicians and dietitians, there's constant vigorous debate and analysis about what foods are healthy, for whom, and in what quantity. Should this same debate be taking place in the games industry? Should game developers be scrutinizing the neurological effects of their games the same way food scrutinizes its effects on people's bodies? We measure our game's value in replayability, graphical fidelity, immersion, narrative poignancy. But what if the most important assessment of a game isn't based on its individual features, but from how it changes you. We know that something once seemingly benign as social media has actually ended up having dramatic psychological and neurological effects on people's mental health. So it's easy to see how gaming, which many of us engage with more deeply and frequently than social media, would be impacting our minds as well. This is something that ought to be discussed in every game review, but right now is never discussed in any. And what might a review of that kind say about COD? I know what mine would say, that COD is the McDonald's of gaming. Popular, tasty, easily accessible, and yes, it's better to eat a Big Mac than go hungry, but McDonald's isn't very good for you and has contributed mightily to the ongoing obesity epidemic, basically by appealing to our primal craving for salt, sugar, and fat. Is COD so different? Is it not McCoddles? You get it because it coddles you? I'm an idiot. The researchers studying the real-world maturity crisis often conclude that the problem is in our brains, both psychological and neurological, the result of years of conditioning by our environment growing up. What if Call of Duty, by mimicking the real-world conditions that contributed to this problem, intentionally or otherwise, has itself become a part of that environment, conditioning us in those same unhealthy ways that stunt our growth? Because what is traditional Call of Duty multiplayer, if not an overprotective parent that goes out of its way to shield its players from any negative stimuli? No respawn times, death streaks, SBMM, which was fair in the same way it'd be fair to let a varsity football player play on the freshman team just to have a chance at starting. A game that's business model relies predominantly on making sure that everyone gets some kills. Zero recoil, no bullet drop or delay. A game which introduced us to the noob tube. Maps so simplistic, symmetric, and blocky that for a while there it looked like a third grader had made them on Minecraft. You'll notice that nowadays they've removed assists from Call of Duty, and anytime you land at least one bullet, they'll just tell you that it was a kill and give you the same amount of points as it was. Points you can use to get a kill streak reward you don't deserve. I got a bunch of gameplay for this video where I thought I went on these epic kill streaks, like these brutal, 15-man kill streaks, multi-kills, and then I go back and I'm watching it in the editor, and I'm not showing up in the kill feed for any of the kills, and I realize they're not my kills. But I totally fell for it. This is a game that embodies participation trophy culture. I remember transitioning from the most popular shooter pre-COD, Halo 3, where you only got XP when you won, and you could only buy armor with the XP you only got when you won, to COD, where you got the match bonus as long as you finished, where even if you didn't finish most of your matches, you'd still rank up and unlock everything pretty effortlessly. There was never any penalty for quitting a match. To this day, there's never been any real penalty for quitting a match. Whereas in games like Halo 3, you would lose XP. In more competitive titles, you get banned. In COD, it was common to see 15th prestigers with .50 KDs and worst win-loss. The care package, which might as well be this game's fucking mascot, specifically designed to give kids a chance at prizes they otherwise never would have had a shot at. Kids going 0-15 and getting rewarded with the best weapon variant in the game from participation supply crates. And a game which offers very little in the way of free play. It's a decidedly structured match, with no real way to combo with your teammates, no sandbox or unstructured activities like you might find in Minecraft, Halo Forge, Rust, Ark, or MMOs. Gibson explains that the testers' complaints ultimately boiled down to the same thing over and over and over again, which was, and I quote, "It doesn't feel like Call of Duty." The implication being that to be successful, the game would have to cater to this crowd to become more like COD. And it's clear that this was the result in other games' focus groups as well, because every game released during that time did become more like Call of Duty. Kill streaks and class customization became standard in every shooter. You saw every game to this day copying some version of the domination and search and destroy game modes. It had a clear and demonstrable influence on games like Titanfall, Crysis 3, and Homefront. Halo, the second most popular shooter behind it, ended up putting in kill streaks, class customization, jump packs, sprint, and ADS. To this day, the game is designed almost as if in homage to Call of Duty. It's Soldier 76 in Overwatch. All of this suggesting that Gibson was right. The trend was much more widespread than his testers alone. It was generational. After all, who wouldn't want to chase the success of a game that was outselling all its competitors near 2-1? But often their efforts backfire, nobody yet realizing that COD's success wasn't because the game itself was good, but because its players were bad, intellectually stunted by real-world forces beyond any dev's understanding. And to this day, you still see its impact in games like Destiny 2, Sea of Thieves, and Fallout 76. These games which are obviously brimming with potential and thus get hyped, but then are monumental disappointments when they finally release. Their core failure is almost always essentially the result of trying to shelter their player bases. These are games that have overprotective developers. Destiny, where they ditched difficulty settings so everybody could feel like a champ, where they ditched raid matchmaking and openly said it was so that nobody would get their feelings hurt. Sea of Thieves, which had a really great open-world PvP system, but where there was never any real punishment for death, and thus no reward for killing, so people got bored. Fallout 76, where if your base gets wrecked, you can instantly respawn it with the blueprint, where there's no loot to lose except for some minor scrap materials, where they've put in multiplayer that has literally no purpose. The devs got on stage and basically said they considered killing other players griefing and that they had implemented strict rules to prevent it, including that you aren't allowed to kill anyone basically without their permission. And the crowd cheered like a bunch of douchebags. Like, if you can't kill strangers for their stuff in a post-apocalyptic open-world PvP environment, what the fuck is even the point? Why put PvP in the game? It's like if on the playground they took out every structure that a kid could possibly get hurt on. What you'd have left is an empty lot. What are these games if not virtual playgrounds, with overprotective developers cutting out all the fun stuff, leaving us empty virtual lots? Every time you see a massively disappointing game like this, I think the failure can really be traced back to the real-world maturity crisis, imported and exacerbated by COD. This is also why Call of Duty itself has changed so little over the years, despite how anxious we all supposedly are for it to do so. At a time when its competitors were desperate to be more like it, why would it be less like itself? Game development is perhaps the most democratic art form there is, every decision focus group tested, and run through the gauntlet of online feedback. The truth is, this franchise has always been a mirror held up to its fan base, and we don't usually like what we see. We didn't want to grow up and they're happy to oblige us so long as they can keep selling us superhero movies in COD. Thus, the gaming industry has suffered its own maturity crisis, and the consequences are abundant. Our relationship with the Call of Duty franchise is rarely a happy one, and gamers did not typically respond positively to those other games that did emulate COD. Indeed, those changes often ripped apart entire communities at the seams, such as with Halo. Many of us, unwilling to move on and throwing our disposable income at COD titles we'd only play for a week, probably missed out on other titles we might have enjoyed more. And there's a long list of games going back much farther than Destiny, Sea of Thieves, and Fallout 76. They could have been great, but sucked because of overprotective devs sheltering immature minds. But worst of all, when eventually our collective infatuation with COD did fizzle after entries like Ghosts and Infinite Warfare, with its popularity tanked and reputation in tatters, moving on to new games like Overwatch, Siege, League, or Battlefield was all the more difficult for the COD player, who starts at a severe disadvantage, their growth stunted, having to learn concepts and build more thoughtful playstyles that the rest of the competition in said games mastered long ago, making the transition painful and the inclination to just not even bother that much stronger, potentially perpetuating a vicious cycle. This reminds me of that article I mentioned, which concluded that millennials are having way less sex than previous generations. It also warned that people who haven't lost their virginity by age 25, a tragedy more common than you might think, are more likely than not to stay a virgin until their 40s, because they now lack the social skills and drive of many of their sexually active peers. The prospect of getting dead ass now too intimidating or difficult to even bother trying. What if there really is a parallel between Call of Duty and virginity? My God. And in the real world generally, economists worry that this maturity crisis is damaging the economy with reduced labor, that our not buying houses and cars is going to fuck everything up, that not having enough children now is going to screw everyone over when we're older because we're not pumping enough new bodies into the workforce as Gen X and millennials begin to retire, and social scientists are gravely concerned about our collective mental health. It's Call of Duty's free market right to disrupt, conquer, or destroy the entire industry for profit if it can. But if Call of Duty has contributed to the real-world epidemic, does it not have a moral obligation to try harder not to fuck up its customers, just as many consumers scrutinize and hold McDonald's or Facebook accountable to a moral obligation not to fuck up their customers? Because the truth is, COD can keep going on this way and continue to profit off of it, because the real-world roots of the problem aren't likely to change anytime soon. Economic inequality is getting worse, college more expensive. Researchers have concluded that the generation after millennials, Generation Z, is, thanks to the prominence of social media, spending even less time developing social skills and engaging in free play than ever before. And it's hard to imagine that millennials, as a generation now suffering from the highest rates of anxiety ever, are going to somehow be less anxious over their kids' safety and general well-being than their parents were. Which is all to say that things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. These thoughts raced through my mind one night as I sat, nearly comatose in the jacuzzi while my 300-pound Tinder date bounced up and down on top of me. I'd given up on everything. I was content to fade out of existence into a fireball of nothingness. But with millions of my fellow gamers stuck in the same mud I was, possibly veering towards the emotional ruin I had faced, an economy teetering on the verge of collapse because millennials had run out of fucks to give, and a class of intelligentsia clearly lacking my superior critical thinking skills, it dawned on me that I was left with no option. I had to get back in the game. What would a healthier Call of Duty look like? If Call of Duty was the model that defined this industry in the last decade, what would be the best model to define it going forward? What game could be the asparagus to COD's McDonald's? What game could inspire McCoddles to put asparagus in its Big Macs? I thought about what kind of game had real free play, where kids interacted with no umpires, no parents or teachers. A game that entailed real accountability, real failure, real setbacks. A game that simulated, perhaps better than any game ever before it, a real ownership of things you value and the responsibility of maintaining and protecting those things. A game with real pain and loss. In short, a game that had everything researchers say we millennials didn't get enough of. If Call of Duty appeals to the worst in us, What kind of game could bring out the best in us? I first discovered RuneScape on addictinggames.com. I thought it was pronounced RuneScape and was expecting some kind of jailbreak game. I was very confused for the first few hours of gameplay, but I rapidly found myself immersed in the world of Gielinor, experiencing all kinds of things that, despite the O2 Java graphics, were so much more real than anything I was experiencing in real life. Many things that I don't think I would have otherwise experienced until after high school. I played the game every day for 4 years, from age 8 to 12. I lived 30 minutes from my school and had to wait at the local library nearly 4 hours after class every day, waiting to get picked up to go home. I'd jerk off 2 or 3 times in the public restroom, and in the hours in between I'd play RuneScape in the computer lab, where technically games weren't allowed, but the librarians didn't mess with me because librarians are always chill as fuck. What made RuneScape so fucking metal was that it had real labor and a real free market economy. At age 9, I was learning about things like supply and demand, time management, and most importantly, people. Labor in RuneScape consisted of mind-numbingly dull gameplay where you essentially sat and watched your character cut a tree, mine a rock, or fish a stream. The process was automatic, but you had to remain vigilant because despite the fact there was nothing to click, if you didn't click anything for 90 seconds, they would auto-log out your character. A policy meant to prevent the rampant botting that eventually destroyed the game anyways. It was the worst of both worlds. There was nothing for you to do, and yet you couldn't divert your attention to anything else. It sucked. It was a process that rested somewhere in between detention and house chores. I don't know why we all liked that stupid fucking game so much. They could have turned skilling into a minigame. That mining mechanic in Fortnite could have worked great, but Jagex was a bunch of cucks who wanted to brainwash us for future careers in assembly lines, careers that ended up getting wiped out by robots in real life anyways, just like they wiped out every entry-level job in RuneScape. The point is, everyone understood the real value of money and items in that game, measured in how many hours of torturous, maniacal labor went into every 300k obsidian shield. Unsurprisingly, tens of thousands of players traded in real-world money for RuneScape gold, feeling the virtual currency was more valuable than the real shit. The labor involved made the virtual items real in a way they've never been for me in other games. When you lost that obsidian shield and ruefully recalled the hours of work that went into obtaining it, it hurt in a very real, visceral way. We were all experiencing these things at age 9, the value of labor and currency that I don't think we otherwise would have until our first real-life jobs a decade later. Just like in real life, if you were smart, you could make a boatload of money without having to do much work. Though you had to be clever, or a risk taker, or both. Trading, or merchanting as we called it, fucking cards that we were, was a mirror of the real world. You bought up resources or physical capital when it was in low demand, sold it off for a hefty profit when demand rose. At age 10, nothing beat the satisfaction of doubling your money on iron ore, except for maybe orgasms, which I had also recently discovered. Alternatively, you could always make a quick buck as a dogshit scammer. Scamming was rampant. To this day, scamming lure tutorials are some of the most popular RuneScape videos on YouTube. I fell for every single one at least once. Hey, say your password out loud. Jagex bleeps it like a cuss word now. Pretty cool, huh? Hey, let me trim your armor for free. Did you know you can clone all your items by dropping them and pressing Alt F4? I'll beat this quest for you. Just pay me 10k and give me your login. I had my gullibility, my faith in humanity purged early on, and in a world of Nigerian princes, hybrid servers, Tinder phishing profiles, pre-orders, cash for gold, male enhancement pills, college loans, Destiny 2, and pyramid schemes, thank Christ for that. I ran my own scams too sometimes. When I was still a low level and always broke, at level 10 I would convince level 3s, people who had literally just started the game, to help me kill this level 11 witch, luring them with promises of gold, potions, and glory. I'd say I could almost beat her myself, I just needed a little help. They would come along to the witch's house in Alcaharid. The witch was programmed to assault anything below level 5 on sight, but at level 10 she left me alone, so the stupid level 3 would follow me into the witch's house, where they'd get pounced on, like the gullible fools they were. I would stand motionless as my victim cried for assistance. Some were stupid enough to try and beat the witch alone. The smarter ones realized what was going on and tried to escape out the front door, which I had already closed and would promptly click shut again every time they clicked it open. Sometimes, just to be a dick, I'd say, "Don't give up, you can do it." Afterwards, I would pick their carcass for loot. It was never very much, just a collection of the starter items you get from Tutorial Island. I would sell it all and get maybe 100 gold. But the truth is, I didn't do it for the loot. I did it because it was a rush to know I had manipulated someone, outsmarted them, and screwed them over. Because in all of us, there's a heart of darkness that enjoys cruelty for no practical reason at all. On the playground, a friend and I used to feed ants we found to a spider because the brutality amused us. This was like that, except a million times better. I was 9 years old, and I did it for the lols. Inevitably, we children formed factions and made war, clans, lusting for the kinds of rewards that can only be won in large groups. My clan was the Rusty Spoons of Death, a name that only narrowly beat out the runner-up, cookie-eating ponies from hell. Like all clans, we would farm the highest level bosses like the King Black Dragon or Calphi Queen for high level gear. We would play Castle Wars for shits and giggles. But like all clans, we knew the true glory lay in the wilderness, where roving bands of warriors sought wealth and glory by way of player killing. The wilderness was RuneScape's PvP. There were few rules, a massive open world area with rare enemies and resources scattered throughout, and the freedom to kill any other players you found. You brought the best gear that you were willing to risk losing, and killed strangers for their stuff. There was no rush quite like the primal satisfaction of looting the equivalent of weeks' worth of work off the body of somebody you've slain. It was the only time I cried in a video game. You learned a lot about yourself out there, and even more about others. One day, me and the boys were out player killing. There was a new friend in our group who I had never really cared for. He had a bunch of X's and O's in his name, which even in 04 was the sign of a huge cunt. The day's killing was done and most people had logged off. I always stayed last because despite our clan being a loose group of friends with no hierarchy, I was technically the clan leader and saw it as my duty to be the last man out. X's and O's waited out till the end too. When it was just us, he suggested we 1v1, just for fun. We'll stop if we dip below 10 HP. I agreed, because you always look like a huge pussy if you turn down a 1v1, and I was clan leader and I couldn't have that. But when my HP fell below 10, he didn't stop. I said, "Hey, what are you doing?" Silence. I started using what heals I had left and ran. He chased me, battering into me with his rune scimitar. I just barely escaped into civilized territory with 3 HP and no heals left. Afterwards I was like, what the fuck? Suddenly, after minutes of silence, he sprang to life in the chat. Nothing but lols, and I was just playing, and good fight. But I knew better. I had an obsidian shield that everybody wanted. The next day I got the clan together for more player killing. I didn't invite Bluebird420, who had introduced us to this X's and O's douche. I had a tall task convincing my clan to murder one of their own in cold blood. I didn't need Blue around to defend the guy and cast doubt on my accusations. Before I invited X's and O's, I sat my squad down and laid out what had happened the day before. I told them I wanted to kill this guy and kick him out of the clan. There was a lot of skepticism, nothing to go on but my word. They wanted to at least put it to a vote, as was our custom. Are you sure you weren't just imagining things? But I was sure, so I threw down the gauntlet. Fuck the vote. I'm gonna kill this guy today, and if you get in my way, I'll kill you too. The reality is, if not enough came around to my way of seeing things, I would likely lose the fight. X's and O's was a much higher level, and some of the clan warned they'd intervene to stop me. They made sensible arguments that we can't condemn someone to execution without any evidence. Besides, he seemed like a nice guy, they said. Others said they had my back no matter what. And so I was risking a civil war that would tear our clan apart. Whoever won the fight, our membership was sure to drop, with friendships destroyed. Everyone was on edge, wondering who would side with who. But in the end, he played himself. He showed up to player kill that day with a new friend, a complete stranger who he said wanted to join. Under normal circumstances, this would be considered a huge faux pas. You don't go into the wildy with strangers. You have to get to know them first, play some castle wars and shit. It's worth mentioning this was at a time when high-level clans were having members infiltrate lower-level ones with secondary accounts to spy and reveal player kill times and locations, setting the higher-level clan up for an easy ambush. But given what I had said happened the day before, the implication was clear to everyone. He wasn't able to finish me off solo, so now he had brought a friend to get the job done. We took him and his friend deep into the woods and whacked them both. They both had expensive gear on because they weren't expecting to die. Afterwards he messaged me, "What the fuck?" I said, "You know that wasn't just playing yesterday." And he didn't message again, because he knew I knew. We were 10 years old. Afterwards, things changed. I purged everyone who had been skeptical of me that day from the clan. This wasn't the mature or right thing to do, but they had pissed me off, and I was suddenly drunk on power. Something about rallying this posse to murder had ignited a fire deep inside me. Outsmarting that prick I didn't like, the satisfaction of hurting him. What else could I do? Things started ramping up then. I didn't just want to bullshit with friends all day. I wanted to put Rusty Spoons of Death on the map. I wanted glory and wealth. I wanted Arsod to become a household name on RuneScape like Dragon Slayers or Zazima, which would mean a lot more killing. Mine is the blood of Vikings, and it ran hot through my veins that day and for many days after. I was done with democracy. Not that we had ever voted on anything terribly important in the past, mainly just what activities we wanted to run on any given day. But I knew we would be voting on important things in the future, and the memory of my clan nearly turning on me in the wild scared the shit out of me and made me angry. My first thought was full-on monarchy, but my closest friends and best fighters weren't on board with that, threatened to leave, because nobody likes to be stripped of power, no matter how insignificant, once they've had it. So instead, the new system would be two-tiered. A select group of those who had proved their loyalty and worth would be lords, who got to vote on things, and everybody else, who didn't. This compromise worked for me. I didn't want to lose my friends. A time would come when I didn't give a shit, but for now, as I had already kicked out everyone who bucked me earlier, I was confident my lords would be loyalists, friends who I was sure I could get to vote my way. It's not like they actually wanted to check my power, they just wanted to feel important. Even though I couldn't articulate it, I understood this instinctively even back then. Though I had no idea what an oligarchy was at the time, I had successfully implemented one. Kinda. And like all oligarchies, it gradually morphed into merely a front for my autocracy. As time went on and our clan membership swelled, new recruits would eventually demand a lordship. Basically everyone got a hard-on for this imaginary incentive structure. I remember laughing about it even then, how silly this all was. And is life so different today? I'm not laughing anymore. People would flatter, bribe, go out of their way to somehow prove themselves, thirsting for the smallest, most insignificant amount of power imaginable. But at 10 years old, $20 made you rich, and a promotion in a RuneScape clan made you important. To get a lordship, they'd have to win a vote among current lords. What it basically came down to was a personality contest. If we thought you were cool, you were in. There was this one guy, though. Biggest ass kiss ever. Painfully phony and way too aggressive about being a lord. Always badgering us about it. So one day, I said, if you pay a tribute to the clan coffers, you're in. And he did. Full set of rune armor, 1,000 yew logs, and 1,000 coal. Fucking idiot. So I said, put on your best garb for the swearing-in ceremony, and then we'll go player killing to celebrate. He put on his best gear. Dragon legs, dragon sword, berserker helmet, berserker ring, amulet of glory. We took him out in the wild and killed him. He started spamming messages, angry and confused, desperate to somehow reverse what had happened, and still be a lord. Deluded enough to ask if this was all just a mistake. We all blocked him. We actually pulled such a large haul off this scam that we started doing it to other new recruits. Just random dudes we didn't care for one way or another. They'd pay us a bunch of good shit, and then we'd kill them and take their other shit. To this day, it was the cruelest, meanest thing I've ever done. And we took so much joy in it. Eventually we had to stop because word was getting around and recruitments were dropping. The important votes mainly revolved around what wars we did and didn't do. I wanted to go to war with just about everyone, as did many others, because war was super fun. A few others were doves. They preferred traditional player killing, whereas a fat group we could hunt down individuals to kill. Fights we were guaranteed to win, but with loot that wasn't nearly as plentiful, combat not nearly as exhilarating. A single war could make an entire clan very wealthy, or leave them hopelessly impoverished. It all came down to risk assessment, who had big-ass balls and who didn't. 9 times out of 10 we voted for war, because little boys loved war. But I remember this one time the doves won the vote, talking up how strong the proposed enemy clan was, that we were sure to lose. They brought up past wars we had lost, which we had been confident we would win, which was a perfectly reasonable argument, but back then I thought it was such a low blow. The wars always began as my idea, and to have all my friends dissecting my failures humiliated me. I had noticed that losing wars bred doves. After they lost a bunch of shit in a lost war, they'd want to go back to just regular player killing, no longer having a taste for risk. There were plenty of other bloodthirsty kids who could lose 9 wars in a row and still fight the 10th, foaming at the mouth with a fucking pickaxe and leather. But that day, the doves used clever words to win the vote. It was the first vote I had lost, and suddenly this oligarchy seemed like an incredibly bad idea. I thought about just doing the war without everyone who had voted against it, but we wouldn't be nearly as strong and would probably lose. Plus, those voting against might have quit in protest. I had to tell the opposing clan leader the war was off. I looked like an idiot. So the next time there was a vote, I sought to exclude the doves. I scheduled the vote for a school night. There was no avoiding every dove, but I knew the 2 clever words users were on the East Coast, 3 hours ahead of us. So I held the vote at 8 PST, which for 10-year-olds on the East Coast meant bedtime, bitches. With the doves not there to twist everyone's minds with their talk of caution, I won the vote. The next day, the 2 doves were pissed, but I played it off like an honest mistake, and they gave me the benefit of the doubt, because just like in real life, doves' aversion to conflict is paradoxically what makes the ideology so impotent. And they showed up for the battle they didn't support because they knew the rules. Any clan member who misses a war without a really good excuse is kicked. So we went to war. And we lost. At the next clan meeting, I got an earful. Everybody was pissed at me. Clan membership dropped sharply. We had lost most of our wars at this point. It occurred to me that the only time my clan had been financially prosperous was when we were scamming and killing our own recruits. Only one person spoke in my defense that day. My queen. My lover. Agno. She made the point that the only way we'd ever get good at wars was if we kept fighting in them to get better. And she brought people around with her wily charms. Agnome was the only girl in our clan. The only girl, as far as any of us knew, that even played RuneScape. Needless to say, we were all madly in love with her. Me, most of all. We would bend over backwards trying to get her to lol because her lols brightened everyone's day. She was one of our best fighters, too, and she would gossip to me about drama between other clan members, who she trusted and who she didn't, and it would turn me on just to have her whisper in my ear. Then one day, after we finished player killing, we were all hanging out in an MSN group chat. We had recently discovered pornographic GIFs. For 10-year-olds in 04, the GIF by itself was still a revolutionary bit of technology, and internet pornography was, for us, the holy grail of all things good in the world. So the combination of these 2 things was an explosive discovery. For whatever reason, there were thousands of these porn GIFs floating around. You could save them to your emote collection. And that day, we all shared the best of our collections. The hottest porn GIFs, the grossest porn GIFs, the funniest porn GIFs. For at least an hour, a dozen 10-year-olds sharing and critiquing 3-second snapshots of naked women, double, triple, or even quadruple our age. It was a glorious chat. But we were oblivious, and silent during all of it was Agno. The next day, she messaged some of us saying goodbye. What? Why? She told us we had creeped her out. She didn't feel comfortable hanging out with us anymore. She was 10 years old too, after all. We were ashamed, humiliated. We lost our favorite person, and one of our best fighters, to a fucking sex scandal. It was the first time I felt something that has become all too familiar over the years. Pure, unadulterated self-hatred. It was my darkest hour on RuneScape, because unlike losing a war or an item, the shame followed you even after you logged off, because it was real. To make things worse, we eventually ran into Agnome again sometime later, in the wild. Someday I will see my ex walking down the street with another man, and it will hurt less than when I saw Agnome player killing with another clan. I didn't notice her at first until one of my clans said, "Hi Agnome, lol." I later kicked him for this because we don't exchange lols with the enemy. It wasn't a planned war, just two player killing clans who accidentally ran into each other and a big ass fight broke out. And when I saw her name, I was suddenly struck with an unbridled rage. Ruin the bitch. All this pain she had caused me, that in the weeks since had never really abated, her presence now reopening the wound. I wanted to erase her from memory and anywhere else I found her. In RuneScape wars, the most common tactic was piling, what these days might be called focusing. Your whole clan goes after one person at a time to remove them from battle as quickly as possible. The idea being you chew through the enemy ranks faster than they chew through yours. Typically, you tried to target their DPS and supports who would die fast while avoiding their tanks who were designed to survive a while. I didn't know what role Agnome was playing that day, but I called the pile on her first. When anyone in our clan died, I ordered them to return from spawn as soon as possible, which was dishonorable but technically allowed in these spontaneous, unofficial fights. I would have sacrificed every last gold piece I had that day to make sure we won the fight. And we did, though it was a tough one. We killed her first, and she was silent about it until the end, when as her character crumpled to the ground, she let out a single frowny face in the chat. In anguish, I screamed, "Agno!" which I later found out was actually pronounced "Ano!" Afterwards, we all felt gross about it. Guys logged off without saying bye, nobody even wanting to discuss the war we had just won, which was unusual. The clan died a whimper of a death after that. People stopped showing up to meetings and events. Our morale was broken, mine most of all. I stopped hosting meetings and events. I let the clan thread on the forums die. Few people messaged me about why the clan wasn't active anymore. Everyone basically knew. It had turned from something fun and lighthearted, friends enjoying a video game, into something stressful and depressing. Losing wars, losing friends, in my quest for power or glory or whatever it was, I had lost everything. I would play solo from then on. These interactions never would have taken place between a bunch of 9 and 10-year-olds anywhere else, because everywhere else there was an authority figure there to arbitrate fairness and implement control. Parents, teachers, coaches, daycare providers, whoever. But in RuneScape there was only Jagex, a handful of neckbeards trying to manage the interactions of hundreds of thousands of children and failing miserably. Some people read Lord of the Flies. We played it. I remember tricking this kid at school out of a Celebi Pokemon card once, rarest card in the game at the time. Told him I would give him $50 at some later date, but he had to give me the card right now so I could win a Pokemon battle later that day with my cousin, who would be out of town shortly. Otherwise it just wouldn't be worth as much to me. A weak play, but we were 7 and he fell for it. I put him off with excuses and delays indefinitely. Fucker ratted, teacher busted me, I was stripped of the card, but more tragically I was robbed of a lesson in morality that I had to learn on RuneScape later when I fucked over someone who'd always had my back. Gary, my wealthy benefactor and sugar daddy, 17 when I was 10, a big brother. Gary, who had always bought me my stuff back when I got hacked or lost everything in a war. Gary, who always had some advice or tip on how to level up faster or get an item easier. Gary, who showed me how to delete my internet browser history. Gary, who one day asked me to farm potato cactus on his account, his bank account swelling with more in-game wealth than I could even comprehend. Suddenly I was overcome by greed and envy and I hacked him. I stole every item he had and transferred it to my account. There'd have been more dignity in robbing a charity worker. I blocked him on everything. But he knew my MSN account and could have gotten a hold of me if he wanted. But he didn't. He stayed silent and let me ghost him, because he knew me well enough to know the guilt would destroy me. And it did. My heart sunk a day at a time. I felt terrible and couldn't understand why. It was just some guy online. It wasn't real. He wasn't real. It's just RuneScape stuff. He can get it all back. He has like 4 maxed out stats. But I think what ate me most was that I had lost somebody I cared about, and worse, someone who had been kind to me. It didn't help that there was a sense of hollowness behind the items and wealth, that I felt I didn't really deserve it, that I hadn't really earned it. I knew I was being a piece of shit, but it's not like anybody ever had to know. But then it doesn't matter what anyone else thought. It matters that you are able to love yourself. And in that moment I realized I couldn't. I returned everything and apologized. He mocked me for caving like a little bitch. And then he told me to keep farming potato cactus. We remain friends to this day. RuneScape had been an emotional roller coaster for me. Soaring highs and steep lows. Moments of triumph, joy, and self-realization. Moments of loss, shame, failure, and self-discovery. Many hard lessons learned. Hours more worth of stories I just don't have time to tell. But I knew even then that I would do it all over again. When I compare my time on RuneScape to the only thing I spent more time on in those days, school, it is like comparing East and West Berlin in the 60s. One is filled with color, life, laughter, freedom, goddammit, while the other is gray, bleak, subdued and regimented. School, where they kept us locked in rooms and fences. School, where we were deprived of our God-given right to explore the world around us. At least in RuneScape we got to explore a world. At least in RuneScape we got to feel what it was to explore. School, where we weren't allowed to talk to other kids except during an hour of lunch, where there wasn't time for play after school because kids had to get home right away for homework and bedtime. They do this to us and then complain about our social skills. School, where they sit us in a chair for 6 hours a day and punish us if we get up without permission and then act confused when there's an obesity epidemic and now an epidemic of sitting, which they just found out is as bad for you as smoking. So what was the classroom if not institutionalized systemic child abuse? And one day we'll look back on K-12 how we look back on electric shock therapy. School, where if someone so much as calls you a butthead, you tell the teacher and they get punished for their words, and this goes on for 20 years, and then we're confused about the prevalence of political correctness on campuses. School, where an unelected authority figure tells you when you can eat, when you can shit or piss, when to stand, when to do what work, and if you don't do the work, you're punished, and then we wonder why the public gravitates towards candidates with autocratic tendencies. This world we've created is creepy. I sometimes can't help but feel that these games we play are more real, more natural than the stifling reality we inhabit. We flock to these games like a sad flower that grows towards the ray of light in a dark tomb, seeking sustenance for our humanity in a world that treats our lives like products on an assembly line. School is the elephant in the room when discussing the maturity crisis. It is where every child spends the majority of their waking hours. It is the experience that shapes and defines us during our most formative years, and yet in all I've read about the problem, school has not been brought up once. Why? Likely because researchers are looking for something specific to millennials because they think the problem is specific to millennials, but I'm not sure that it is. Rather, I feel with millennials the problem has simply hit a critical mass where it can no longer be ignored, when in fact this has been going on for quite some time. Long before we were on the stage, billions were being spent every year on big dick placebo pills and boob jobs. It was our boomer president and Gen X presidential candidate who mocked each other's genitals on stage. Because it's not just millennials that are stuck in adolescence. A response to 9/11 was not the act of an emotionally mature or stable citizenry, nor was the 2016 election, regardless of its outcome. Boomers and Gen Xers were born literally the most powerful and wealthy generations of human beings to ever exist in human history. They have left us debt and fired. They grossly mismanaged the financial system, they aided and abetted our slide towards oligarchy, blithely participated in environmental catastrophe, and have gotten us involved in 3 wars which after costing us dearly in blood and treasure we have nothing to show for. Millennials will spend the rest of our lives cleaning up their mess, their failures, environmentally, economically, geopolitically, emotionally, and they should hope we succeed in this, because if we fail, there won't be many generations after ours. And despite having everything, every poll tells us our parents and grandparents are on average bitter and angry. If these morons are what counts for adults, then perhaps the entire concept is grossly overrated. What if it is not our path towards adulthood that is defunct, but our entire definition of what maturity is? That our so-called intellectual elite so unquestionably accepts that a person's maturity is defined predominantly by whether or not they own cars, is itself an indictment of how immature the entire nation has become. There is, in fact, a growing movement and body of evidence to support the practice of unschooling. Unschoolers argue that children learn best when left to their own devices to engage in self-directed, unstructured educational activities, pursuing their passions, personal interests, play, and social interaction. It's essentially a form of homeschooling that advocates free play as a primary educational method. Imagine if your entire school day had been one long recess. They further posit that the present K-12 system is at the root of the mental health crises afflicting young people today, that the epidemics of depression, anxiety, burnout, and suicide can be traced to a rigid, inflexible education system that, when accounting for homework, typically pushes children and teenagers well past the 40 hours of labor a week that is considered the max safe limit for even adults' mental health. Indeed, it is no coincidence that the highest rates of these mental health problems are recorded on college campuses. There is, unsurprisingly, debate on the subject. A relatively young and not thoroughly researched system, many parents understandably feel uneasy about simply relinquishing control and letting the kids run wild. But if there is a salient argument in its defense, it's that today economists and social scientists have reached uniform consensus that kids aren't getting enough of the exact things that unschoolers are advocating for, and are suffering from the exact problems unschoolers are trying to fix. Given this, it seems clear that a discussion over incorporating at least a measure of unschooling into traditional educational curriculum is warranted. After all, it's apparent something needs to be done differently, and we could not possibly do worse than we are now. Indeed, politicians on both sides of the aisle have agreed for decades that the present education system is in dire need of reform. It's just that they can rarely find consensus on what that reform should look like, and many solutions they have tried ended up sucking eggs. Could unschooling be the answer? And what might an unschooling educational system look like? More recess, shorter school weeks, or perhaps RuneScape. Unschoolers stress it's imperative that parents and educators provide a measure of support to students, i.e. you can't just leave them alone in an empty room all day. They need access to books, the internet, playgrounds, sports, social interaction, and various other resources, tools, and outlets to pursue their interests. An environment that is unstructured but still substantive. And when they describe unschooling methods and what an unschooled student's pursuit of knowledge looks like, It sounds so identical to my experiences on RuneScape and other games. Unschooling students learn through their natural life experiences and exploration of activities initiated by the children themselves, believing that the more personal learning is the more meaningful, well understood, and therefore useful it is to the child. At the end of my time on RuneScape, I felt I understood the real world a little better. The dark sides of man, the nuances of supply and demand, bad investments, learning the toil of saving up for something, the satisfaction of finally getting it, the gut punch in losing it, some government and even some parliamentary tactics with the bedtime stuff. Building consensus, reading people, weighing their interest against your own and sniffing out ulterior motives. Learning about myself, my weaknesses, my strengths, how powerful that urge for glory and wealth is, how it can drive you, how it can destroy you. And once you've felt it, you recognize it in others and you start to see how fucking wild the world is because you realize the people running it are just looking to make a name for themselves and you know just how far they'll go to do it. It was a deeper learning, distinct from the classroom where I undoubtedly had memorized more factoids and bits of information, but none of which I can recall now. That most people can't recall now according to the research. The fool COO of Riot Games who got in trouble for grabbing people's balls and farting in girls' faces at work. I never would have made that mistake because I learned the shit with A-Gnome when I was 10. We have required reading in schools and plenty of educational films, but what if we had required gaming? Recently, RuneScape was released on iOS and it also remains free and easily accessible on just about any computer with internet access. It would cost schools nothing and I think every 5th grader in America should be required to play it. And many other games, but only the right kind of games. A properly done game can be the ultimate free play activity, a master playground. It can provide tools, resources, and challenges that would be extremely difficult to replicate in the real world, allowing you to access, test, and explore parts of yourself, the human condition, and life that you otherwise couldn't. I think of players pursuing their passions and interests and the incredible things they eventually accomplished in games like Minecraft, where they've built one-to-one replicas of the USS Enterprise in New York City. The absurd amount of strategy, coordination, spycraft, and political intrigue behind those massive 1,000-on-1,000 player space battles in games like EVE Online. I think of the extreme labor, long-term planning, time management, and group effort behind the colossal bases and fights in a game like Rust. I think about the lessons learned, how much people must have grown in pursuit of those things, in their magnificent conflict with other aspiring minds. Surely such things would compare favorably to whatever the scientists say we're supposed to be learning on just regular playgrounds doing make-believe. In both high school and community college, I took semester-long classes called group studies. You did a bunch of random projects and you were supposed to learn about working with others. You know, it's the bullshit where you all anonymously evaluate each other at project's end. But these were easy courses that everyone took with their friends basically just to fuck off. Everyone would agree to do the one simple job. I'll get some cardboard and spray paint it black. Okay, I'll print out some articles and planets. Whoop-de-doo. I know for a fact I learned more about working in a group from games like Overwatch than I ever did from those classes, which were much more expensive for myself or the state than the games. You learn how to force yourself to get along with people you don't like, if for no other reason than to win. You learn viscerally that getting pissed off at one another and abusing your teammates never helps anything. You learn that if you refuse to be a team player or pull your own weight, you'll develop a reputation and people won't want to play with you anymore. I sometimes wonder if it'd be better to just have a whole class play Overwatch for a semester. Everyone who reaches GM gets an A. If you don't make Diamond, you get a fucking F. I think of gamers writ large. I think of Twitch, YouTube, and MLG, these overlapping billion-dollar industries that didn't exist 10 years ago, that have all spawned from kids doing free play in their bedrooms, and now they're churning out millionaires, and the owner of the Patriots is buying MLG teams. Millions of young people making a livelihood off this shit that there was no degree for, no formal training or education. I think of how fast new industries are cropping up, how so much of the big stuff today couldn't have been taught in schools because it didn't exist when we were kids. I think of what future industries will crop up and how that shit isn't being taught today. John Holt, widely regarded as the father of the unschooling method, is quoted as saying, "Since we can't know what knowledge will be most needed in the future, it's senseless to try and teach it in advance. Instead, we should try to turn out people who love learning so much and learn so well that they will be able to learn whatever must be learned." His comments were echoed by celebrated authors and businessmen such as Peter Drucker, who said the most important skill in the 21st century will be learning new skills. Everything else will become obsolete over time. And Alvin Toffler, who said the illiterate of the 21st century are not those who cannot read or write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And who is better equipped for such a century than the gamer? The gamer who must learn new characters, habits, mechanics, and rules in each new game they play, who must learn to adapt the mind to a game like Siege, and then Overwatch, and then Rocket League, and then Battlefield, and then Red Dead, and so on and so forth for every new game they play. The intricate diversity, the complexity of each of those games. The differences between characters like Reaper and Zenyatta in Overwatch, Ashe and Montaigne in Siege, the Bomber and the Medic in Battlefield. So many obstacles, so many challenges. Every gamer constantly striving to learn new things, often in fierce contention with other gamers, pushing one another to new limits. Each time starting over as a noob, only to attain mastery yet again. Some of us doing it with a dozen games a year, every year, just as they say everyone will have to in real life with the barrage of new subjects and challenges that await us in this lifetime, this century, where the law of accelerating return stipulates that we will see, relative to human history, 20,000 years worth of technological progress in our lifetimes. That gaming could be a platform for growth and education isn't a new concept. It was first introduced to us in the sick-ass book and later on so-so movie Ender's Game. But even before that, astronauts and Air Force pilots were playing flight simulation video games to prepare for the real thing. just like nowadays we all play a lot of Battle Royale to prepare for life after the 2020 election. Video games are the future of human education, of human evolution. I had a dream last night of the Dukedobbins Academy, each class a different game, students given a clear but difficult objective to complete in order to pass, and no instruction on how. First period is RuneScape, where you don't pass till you've amassed 10 million gold. After the 6th grade, this class switches to EVE Online. Second period is Ark Survival, where you and your group must tame a Titanosaurus. Third period is Overwatch, where you must hit GM. Fourth period is Blackout, where your squad must amass 100 wins. Fifth period is Minecraft, where in a given period you must build the greatest structure you possibly can, and you are graded on just how good the instructor thinks it is. Sixth period is Story Games. KOTOR, Skyrim, Last of Us, Tales of the Walking Dead. Every semester, a whole new set of classes relying on new games, pushing students to learn and adapt the mind on a neurological level to new challenges, new obstacles, neuroplasticity, neurofluidity, exposure, adaptation, kill, kill, kill. I am not kidding about any of this. It's not a joke. This is the future, and I'll do it myself if I have to. I think of the fact that researchers have concluded decisively that gamers perform better than their non-gaming peers by almost every available measurement of mental faculty. But obviously the gamer has not been immune to the maturity crisis or millennials' problems generally. But then the gamer was still subject to the same forces that caused the shit, whether it was school, overprotective parents, participation trophy culture, bad luck economically. Though I suspect the real issue is the gamer's potential, that gaming's potential, has been held back by one of our own. There are good schools that educate, and then there are for-profit schools that rob and confuse. Just as you can be taught productive things like math, you can be taught super counterproductive things like the world was created in 7 days, or white supremacy, or sex ed that's meant to scare instead of inform. There's educational reading, like Ron Chernow's Hamilton. There's shit reading, like Mein Kampf. There's information, and there's misinformation. There are educational films like Lincoln, and then there's pornography that only fries the dopamine circuits and gives young men deeply flawed impressions of what real sex ought to look like. There are games like RuneScape, EVE Online, Rust, Minecraft, and then there are games like COD, Destiny, and Fallout 76. It took me about 2 months to realize that COD wasn't only giving a full kills points for my assists, but that they were counting my assists as kills on the actual scoreboard. This might make sense in a game like Overwatch or even Blackout, but in the multiplayer, with time to kill faster than half a second, it's absurd. I only realized in the end because I kept noticing these matches where every single player in the lobby was going positive and I didn't understand how that was even possible. And then it hit me. It was all bullshit, as usual. Before then, I'd really thought I'd hit some new plane of COD ability. I was dropping these absurdly high kill games, 50, 60, 80 kills, breaking 100 kills on Nuketown every time. I was like, wow, I guess after 10 years I really am the fucking master. Whew, boy, did I feel dumb when I realized it was all a lie. And how many other players are confused on the same point, falsely believing they are doing really well when they're not? And even those that figure it out, they might not see that score as illegitimately as I do. If by the game's own rules they are doing well, then they are, and who can fault them for reaching such a conclusion? COD's menace, its financial success, is in its illusory tactics. How many players will simply refuse to move on to trying a new game when with such ease they can achieve such success in their gameplay on COD? And thus, instead of growing and seizing all that the medium has to offer, so many get hooked on this hamster wheel of a game that offers so very little in the way of personal growth. You can advance through 75 levels, but you aren't going to play the game in a notably different way at max prestige than you did at level 1. The guns are so very similar with so low recoil and such low time to kill. Such small uniform maps. Don't get me wrong, there's fun to be had, smoke a bowl, put on the Spotify app, just run around almost on autopilot enjoying the instant gratification like eating the whole bag of fucking Doritos. But in today's multiplayer, half the maps are the same ones I was playing when I was 16 in 2011. This isn't growth. The guns are all the same as they were back then too, in operation if not aesthetics. It does not push the mind to new limits, it does not require intellectual effort, and that is of course a part of its appeal. The new Blackout mode is an exception. I like Blackout. Its longer time to kill, addition of standard gun mechanics like bullet drop, and complex map make it challenging and rewarding in a way that the traditional multiplayer isn't. Perhaps this is more to do with the Battle Royale mode, which I have yet to see an unpopular version of. In conjunction with Zombies, Extinction, Dead Ops, Spec Ops, third-person tactical modes, past campaigns, and multiplayer iterations, it's a testament to how versatile this franchise can be, making it all the more depressing to think how little novelty there has been in the last decade. Unsurprisingly, the newest thing in COD, and the most challenging thing in COD, is also the most popular mode in COD right now. This game grew this year and we liked it. Gamers have instinctively sought growth in the industry. It's behind the constant thirst for DLC, for new games, new updates. It's why games like Fortnite have made a killing, with development and marketing emphasis on a living world, constantly evolving, changing, growing with you. Live events, unique experiences, new memories. And COD has always had the illusion of new. Every year a new game that is the same game. Robbing players of growth, robbing the industry of growth. Call of Duty, which spent much of the last decade as the poster boy for gaming to the outside world, our most popular, financially successful title, is that which shows the least, the worst gaming has to offer. Gaming cannot fulfill its destiny as mankind's greatest art medium, mankind's primary educational platform, until this industry looks less like COD, and more like RuneScape.